Hey folks, just a warning that this episode talks about war, violence, deportation, and detention. Please take care of yourself and those around you whilst listening to this episode. It's the evening of the 5th of March 2018. Priya, Nades, Kopika and Tharanika have just been removed from their home in Biloela to be taken to a detention centre in Melbourne.
They were told by the immigration department that new bridging visas were coming by post. Instead, the police showed up.
I didn't even know what to do. I didn't understand what I should do.
Being taken literally the day after your visa expires is not what normally happens. Here's the family's lawyer, Karina Ford.
The fact that they chose to not only detain them, but travel to a regional town early that morning to detain them. It just doesn't normally ever happen that way.
The family were awoken early that morning where they're given 10 minutes to change their clothes. They were not allowed to pack any food or snacks for the kids.
And their youngest daughter, Dharnika, is only 8 months old. By the time they touch down in Melbourne, it's around 4:30 or 5 p.m.
There was no food, milk or snacks for the kids during this time. There was absolutely nothing for the kids, nothing for two little children. As soon as we got off the plane, we were immediately escorted onto vehicles which were parked right next to the plane. We couldn't look to our left or right. We would just get off the plane directly into the vehicle where we would be taken away.
The family are taken to Melbourne Immigration Transit Accommodation, or MITA for short.
When they took us there, it didn't look like detention. It looked like we were going to a jail. There were 3 security barriers. The first was an electric gate. Then there was a second gate. Then the vehicle was checked with a detector, and then we finally got to the detention centre.
They took us into the detention centre and started logging all of our things. By the time this all finished, it would have been around 11 p.m. when we were taken to our accommodation.
We then had to attend a medical checkup at 6 a.m. IHMS did all these checkups. It was very onerous.
The IHMS is the organisation that's contracted to provide medical services to our detention centres.
Even after all this was done, we still didn't have any food. Eventually, what they had for us was chicken, rice and salad. How do I give an 8-month-old baby chicken, rice and salad? There was no food for a baby.
We asked Serco about this, and they say all detainees are provided appropriate food and beverage while in their care. Now, the family are told they can't get access to a phone unless they sign documents saying that they would leave the country.
We said to them that we needed to speak to people in our community. We said that we needed to speak to our lawyer. They said, if you sign these documents and volunteer to leave the country, we will let you use the phone.
3 days passed. I had decided, let's sign the papers, get the number and contact our lawyer, because if we didn't sign it, we wouldn't be able to call anyone and we wouldn't be able to do anything if they tried to deport us.
They finally get in touch with a lawyer.
We couldn't email a single thing. Even to see a lawyer, we needed approval that would take 48 hours. Their job was to keep the clock ticking and pass the time in order to get our travel documents ready to deport us.
5 days after they speak with their lawyer, the lawyer calls and says that an injunction against deportation, a court order that would allow them to stay in the country, is coming that day. Priya refers to this as a stay order. They're hopeful, but it doesn't arrive in time.
At around 2 p.m, 50 or so Serco guards came and dragged me one way, dragged Nades another way, and dragged the kids in another direction. They said that we are going to Melbourne Airport so that they could deport us. They put me in one vehicle and put Nades and the kids in another vehicle. Nades and I couldn't talk to each other. I asked to speak to a lawyer. The immigration officer didn't respond. The plane left for Sydney. As I was seated, there were 4 Serco guards holding me down. As the plane landed in Sydney, I stood up and said I needed to speak to a lawyer as a stay order had been granted. I told them, if you take me after a stay order has been granted, firstly, you will lose your job. And secondly, the minister will also lose his job. I asked him if they knew that. I don't know what he was thinking at that point. I had memorized my lawyer's number, so he rang my lawyer and handed me the phone. The lawyer told me that a stay order had been granted and they could not deport us.
Despite this, they're put on a plane.
The plane picked up some young men from Sydney,
Other Tamil asylum seekers,
and then departed for Perth. Once the plane landed in Perth, I was given an interpreter who was trying to comfort me. She said that nothing will happen and that I should calm down. I said, You didn't come here to tell me these things. You are here to interpret. Don't control me. I will do what I need to do. Shut your mouth and do your job, or I will break your nose. That's what I said.
The family are eventually told by the interpreter that they're going back to Melbourne. They are placed in an apartment for the night.
What happened to the other asylum seekers on the plane?
They're sent back to Sri Lanka.
The following evening around 6 p.m, they took us to the airport and flew us to Melbourne on the same plane. Once we got to Melbourne, they placed us in the same accommodation with the same drama.
Circle refutes any claim that Priya was handled inappropriately.
Over 3 years in Biloela, and just like that, they're forcibly removed from their homes and almost deported. Now, they're locked up in a detention centre in Melbourne.
Now, you would think that with the amount of money that goes into detention centers, that they'd be kind of nice, with activities and good facilities.
And we have diplomats and sources in countries all around the world. Surely our information on a country like Sri Lanka that we have a close relationship with would be accurate.
So you would assume that when our own reports say it is safe for Tamil people to return home, it would actually be safe.
You have been told a lie.
To stop the deportation of a Tamil family.
Let them in! Let them stay!
Protecting Australia's borders.
Hypocrisy.
Detained on Christmas Island.
United Nations Convention on Refugees.
This is our country.
We are a generous, open-hearted people.
A lie.
I am Jay Ui.
I'm Dinesh, the Leonard Raja.
This is episode 3, Track Changes. Wow, what a whirlwind of a couple of weeks for them.
Yeah, almost 3.5 years in the Queensland town of Biloela, like they've built a life there. And one day, they've just disappeared.
It's almost like the Avengers. Thanos has snapped his fingers and without any warning, they're gone.
The family's secret and sudden displacement from Biloela was as much a shock to the community as it was the family. But one of the first people to discover that the family had been taken was Priya's hospital social worker, Bronwyn Dendel.
The physio came into my office and said, oh, look, Priya hasn't turned up for her appointment. And that's really unusual. It's not like Priya, like she was very committed and dedicated to any appointments. You know, she had a lot of respect for, you know, anyone that she was working with her. So I tried to give her a call and the phone didn't even go to a message bank. So a little flag went up, but at that stage I wasn't overly alarmed.
Bron is the sort of mum that's involved in so many community groups you'd think it's impossible, especially with 5 kids. But then she sees another need in the community and feels compelled to help there too.
And she had also been advocating for the family before they were taken.
When I wrote a letter to the then Immigration Minister, Peter Dutton, I genuinely believed that my letter about how detrimental it would be for the children to be sent to a country they didn't know and how detrimental it would be to Priya's health, I just thought, well, that should be enough.
So how did she actually find out what had happened to the family?
Well, the family's neighbor had actually witnessed Priya screaming as they were being removed and had spoken about it with her friends, one of which worked with Bronwyn.
And they said, look, we've just heard that these big vans came and that they took Priya and Nades and the girls away. You know, it was obviously border force and they've been deported. I first was in shock and then just burst into tears because, you know, we'd been trying for 2 years to explain to the government why this family needed to stay, and it made perfect sense to everybody. That was it. And I remember saying to this one other worker when she said, there's not a thing we can do about it now, Bronwyn, that's it. And I just remember saying, like hell there isn't. This is not happening on my watch. No, thank you.
So if the government is like Thanos, this right here is the start of the Avengers, the start of the campaign to bring the family back to Biloela.
Avengers, assemble! Now, Bronwyn gets contacted by Aaron from the Tamil Refugee Council to get some statements for a press release.
Talking to a number of people, we knew that there was outrage in the community. And to express that outrage, in order to rally behind the family, you needed a face. So I thought Bronwyn could be that person.
But Bronwyn said her boss at Queensland Health said she can't speak publicly about this.
And I had been told / warned that it wasn't part of my role and that I was not to get political and that I was to leave it be.
She's not going to leave it be, is she?
So I couldn't speak, but thankfully I had a friend and a colleague, Angela Fredericks, who was also a social worker, but had gone out into private practice by this stage. So I thought that's the ticket.
It actually wasn't until several days later that I did actually find out.
This is Angela Fredericks, a RuPaul's Drag Race enthusiast who's incredibly lovely and warm, and the sort of person who will put her entire life on hold to help people in need.
I do remember just sitting on the phone with Priya while she sobbed, and all I could do was just keep saying, "We've got you." Yeah, and I've been living by those words ever since.
And I said, I think we need to fight this. We need to do everything we can. And she doesn't hesitate. She's like, absolutely. When do we ride type of attitude.
We connected everyone. We put the story together and we put out the press release the next day.
The ABC interviews Angela and things start to move quickly.
I arrived at work and my phone started running hot. People from... I had a phone call from someone saying they were from the project. And I'm like, okay, which project are you talking about? And they're like, no, Channel 10, the project. So I was getting phone calls from 7, 9, 10, SBS. And my manager at the time decided to pull me aside and say, you're on work time. This is not work stuff. You're going to end up with a warning. It's not okay. So I developed a sudden illness and went home. And then went to Angela. And then so Angela was doing all of the interviews and, just spearheaded it from there.
Then Ben Doherty writes about the story for The Guardian.
It just struck me that it was an incredibly disproportionate response for what the situation required. This wasn't a family that was resisting, that was trying to game the system in some way. This was a family engaging in good faith with Australia's asylum system. We were able to publish a story pretty quickly, and that really kind of, I suppose, set the ball rolling.
And then it kind of seemed to gather traction, and someone messaged us and said, you should start a petition. And Andrew and I were like, do you know how to do that? No, I guess we could Google it.
So the Avengers are sort of gathering and organising, but we still have the family in detention. So what was the detention centre actually like?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to. A number of Biloela residents visited the family in detention.
Push the buzzer to get into the compound.
It's the setting of a prison. So the big fencing, the big gated door.
You're allowed to take some snacks in to the person that you're visiting, but it's not allowed to be fresh fruit or fresh food at all.
What I did do, though, was I bought a shawl with me and I wore it in, and then I gave it to Priya and just said, look, you put this shawl around you and it's just a big hug from people in Biloela.
And then you step into this room, which is just like a mass hall with all these tables.
And Nadis would be up there, he'd be making you coffee or tea and providing biscuits. And
he goes and he makes you a cup of tea and just still trying to make it as pleasant for me as possible, which it's just insane.
And it was very upsetting to see Nades, who I had remembered as this lovely, bouncy, smiley fellow from Biloela, but looking absolutely like a broken man, like the weight of the world was on his shoulders.
Some guards were very strict in that you couldn't leave your table. You don't try to tell a toddler they've got to stay in one spot for 2 hours. Doesn't happen.
You can't imagine not being able to just go to the shop or just go outside, even space without the children right in the room with you all the time. Raising children at the best of times is hard going, let alone in such tight quarters where they had no space from each other.
It was a very dehumanising process to see all of these structures in place controlling people. That would have been a moment where you sort of think, I'm not going to leave them on their own. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm not going to leave them on their own.
Wow, all of these people who knew the family when they were in Biloela, travelling to Melbourne just to comfort this family. It's such an incredible showing of support. But what is the detention centre like for the family?
3 or 4 Serco officers would always be watching us. They would open our bedroom door as well as the toilet door. They made it very difficult for us.
Not even the toilet is private? I feel like that's my one space where I can't be disturbed.
I just want to poo in silence and peace and with good acoustics.
Acoustics are important to you when you poo, aren't they?
It is very, very important.
They were checking on us at night. When we'd ask why they were harassing us like this, they would say, "You are people that were meant to be deported. If you did something to yourselves, how would that look?" They would be with us 24 hours a day.
While we were sleeping, they would check in on us every 30 minutes. They wouldn't knock. I told them, "There are 4 of you. If you need something, just knock and ask." Priya could be breastfeeding. We have a small child that needs to be fed. I told them not to open the door without knocking, to have manners, but they wouldn't listen. They would just barge in.
All these constant checks feel a little over the top.
We don't know exactly why it's happening to this family, but there was a joint committee review of Australia's detention centres, and it talks about this thing called suicide watch.
Right, where a guard would have to check on them every 30 minutes and keep a log and kind of stay near them at all times because they were at risk of taking their own lives.
And detainees can be placed on suicide watch with or without their consent. One psychologist on Christmas Island said the constant monitoring, quote, would often be perceived as punitive by the client and would sometimes increase a detainee's distress and paranoia about the situation they were in.
Now, we don't know whether the family were actually on suicide watch, but their experience sure sounds like it.
Anytime we went to the visitation area, they would do 2 checks. For the first check, they would pat their hands all over our bodies. The second check involved a scanner machine. When they would check us, they were required to have a witness. It was uncomfortable.
Another thing the review found was that, quote, a significant proportion of officers on duty in centres are not adequately trained to perform the roles expected of them.
They would give food from their kitchen, but they didn't have food that was suitable for children. We would get the same menu as all other adults in Australian detention centres. There was no baby food, soft cheeses or fruits that were appropriate for kids beyond oranges, apples and pears. We couldn't ask for anything else.
Journalist Rebecca Holt, who has been to the Melbourne Detention Centre over 100 times, heard this as well.
The parents I interviewed, including Priya and Nades, really struggled to get what they thought was the food their children needed.
They didn't even have access to a blender to make baby food until early 2019, nearly a year into detention.
And making it even more frustrating, the parents had to try and make food with only disposable plastic picnic cutlery because they're never given knives. That's just impossible when you think about having to make baby food.
Wow, making baby food with a plastic knife sounds ridiculous.
There were a couple of teenagers there, but the only other child in this detention centre was a Vietnamese baby.
Both mothers, Priya and the mother of the Vietnamese baby, told me that they were not allowed to see each other. So Kopika and Tanaka couldn't see the only other toddler in the centre. I was told by both women that guards had told them the families were not allowed to mix. They'd been telling me that they were only let out of their units, by which I mean their kind of cabins, for 30 minutes a day, play on the playground.
Aside from medical checkups and visitors, they were stuck in their accommodation. Now, this does change shortly after Rebecca asks them why the toddlers can't interact with each other, but it has a real impact on their kids, particularly the older child, Kopika.
She was an independent girl, but when she was put in detention, she started to pull out her hair. She couldn't go outside. She couldn't get any of the things she wanted. So she started pulling her hair, biting her fingers, pushing Taranika around. It was mental torture for her. I thought, oh God, what is my daughter going through? So then I would pretend to be a toddler and play with her to get her out of her rut.
Rebecca was given access to a medical report from the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. The report said,
Kopika was biting her arm when she got frustrated, and she was noticeably very angry with the people around her, and the people around her were her family.
The only time that they got to see any other children was when they had visitors, and that was pretty infrequent at the beginning.
This is Legal Eagle Simone from episode 1, Nadesa's old English teacher.
My daughter Isabel is very good with kids and loves kids, and she was struck by the story of Nades and Priya, so she was more than happy to come along. Just tried to sort of warn her about what it would be like, and she coped very well. And it was a lovely little bright spot, actually, to see 3 kids just sort of playing together, and Kopika and Tanika were not so aware of all of the things that their parents were worried about. So in those moments, they were just able to play quite freely.
And it is this continual support from the community that gives this family hope. The phone calls, the gifts, and the visits.
They said, be strong. We are with you. We will not let you go. You will definitely come back to Biloela. They made this pledge to us.
I didn't want them to be on their own in Melbourne as well, because they didn't really know too many people in Melbourne.
They may take you from Biloela, but Biloela doesn't leave you.
But while this is all happening, them stuck in detention, I mean, they have this injunction against deportation that came in just as they were about to be deported. That means there's some legal issue that needs to be sorted out first, right?
I mean, yeah, it's all a bit technical, but basically their appeals are knocked back. It's escalated to a higher court and it's knocked back again. But remember in the first episode about how we talked about only arguing about procedural matters?
That's right. They can't really resubmit their visa application or ask for it to be reassessed. They can only appeal on the procedural matters.
Yeah, or as Simone puts it, that
some error of law was made in the decision maker's process.
So you can't reapply for a protection visa after your first one's been denied, which means this first visa application is really, really important.
Yeah, but as we've seen, asylum seekers like Priya and Nades don't always have the best resources or even the right connections to make this first application and interview the best that it can be. They also don't have easy access to legal representation, let alone good representation. Here's the family's big fancy lawyer echoing this.
So there is no doubt that it can make a difference in terms of how cases are articulated in writing, but also in terms of for preparing them to be able to answer questions and understand the process. Country research also is a real great benefit where you have people represented.
What does she mean by country research?
Well, for every protection visa submitted by an asylum seeker, the people assessing their claims need to know what is happening in their country of origin. So for people like Priya and Nades, they're able to submit information about Sri Lanka to show what the situation is like there.
Right, gotcha. So sort of like, here's why Sri Lanka is unsafe for me to return to. Here are some reports or articles or sources showing what the situation was like and is like there.
Yeah, and like the family lawyer said, this is something that proper legal representation can help with.
Right, but without it, how would you know what to submit or even that you need to submit this information at all?
Exactly. But there's actually a document that has to be taken into consideration.
Like compulsory?
Compulsory. It's a document called the
DFAT Country Information Report.
Country information.
Yeah, the DFAT Country Report.
Country reports.
So many people mention the Country Information Report to us, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The reports are prepared by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or DFAT, on the asylum seeker's country of origin, in this case Sri Lanka, and they're drawn up for the sole purpose of assessing their claims. They outline things like geography, population, current and past issues, the stability of the country, and how safe it is for people.
That sounds like a good thing, right? I mean, if asylum seekers like Priya and Nades don't know they need to submit this information, at least the assessors have something to go off, especially if they're like me and didn't really know much about what's happening in Sri Lanka.
Well, it would be good if it was accurate, but it would be very bad if it wasn't, since it has to be taken into consideration.
So, is it accurate?
What do you think?
I'm not going to like this, am I?
Probably not. So there have been a handful of editions of Sri Lanka's Country Information Report ever since DFAT first started releasing them in 2013. The latest one at the time of recording is December 2021. And to dissect whether the reports are accurate, you're going to hear from a few voices in this next section. You'll hear from Avani Selvarajah, or Avi for short.
I am a senior legal officer with PEARL, so that's People for Equality and Relief in Lanka.
As well as Abhinaya Nathan.
I have been an editor and a writer at Tamil Guardian for the last 10 years.
Which is an English language newspaper turned website on all things Ulam Tamil worldwide. You'll also hear from Damien Kingsbury from episode 2, Emeritus Professor of Deakin University.
Sure, of course.
And lastly, someone who regularly feeds information to DFAT about Sri Lanka and has been doing so for over 10 years. He's got contacts on the ground in Sri Lanka, grew up there himself, and he says he has
some political connection, which is very high level, actually. Probably I would say the highest level in the country, actually.
You'll have to speculate on what this highest level means, and he's asked to remain anonymous, but
you can use my voice, and you can say Krishna if you want, but not my name.
And we can't reveal our sources, but we can say we have verified he does report to DFAT.
Juicy.
Let's get into it. Jay, can you read this section of the 2013 report?
Its economy is worth approximately $65 billion and its GDP per capita is...
Not that bit. There's a lot of economic and demographic stuff in there, but that's not the juicy stuff. Can you read that bit there?
Okay. So, quote, the Northern Province, as an area formerly controlled by the LTTE, is more heavily militarized than the rest of the country. While the population of the Northern Province is predominantly Tamil, this monitoring would apply to any persons who live in the province.
Distinction, if you like, between North and South is that in the North you have preponderance of Tamils, overwhelmingly Tamil areas.
It's anywhere Tamil people consider a homeland that's heavily militarized.
So the North and the East are pretty much the only areas that are militarized, and it's because they're predominantly Tamil areas.
Right, but the report makes it seem like it's not because it's a Tamil area.
I believe the intended motivation is to eradicate any signs of a Tamil homeland.
But can we talk about what this militarization actually looks like? I'm just struggling to picture it.
Imagine like every day when you're grabbing your morning oat latte, you see the army just...
Mostly standing around. They're meant to just have like a intimidating presence, right?
Or imagine driving down the Great Ocean Road and seeing an army camp at every intersection.
You will see like huge tracts of closed off land, barbed wire.
The school I went, Hartley College, the one side at the boundary, there's an army camp. Come on, what are you talking? So it's a simple example, you know?
They run the schools, they run the businesses, they run the resorts, they run tourism, they've taken over everything, they're everywhere. You basically just have to live with it. They acquire, in inverted commas, land and build these things. It puts Tamil people out of business because they're competing with Tamil local businesses. It puts parents at unease knowing that their kids are going to school being taught by someone who could potentially be the perpetrator of a war crime.
It is in effect an occupied country in its own right, and the Tamil people do feel that they are being militarily occupied. Many of them have been moved or pushed out of their homes, their lands have been occupied.
It's this constant reminder that you're not trusted and that the government needs to watch you.
Yeah, it's like that feeling when you're driving down the highway and you see a police car. You're not even speeding, but you hit the brakes anyway. Except in the north and east of Sri Lanka, you're not even driving and they're just everywhere all of the time.
Exactly. The country reports talk about this military occupation, but they don't talk about why it's happening or the effect it has on Tamil people's connection to the north and the east. As Krishna puts it,
it's a huge psychological impact, you know, the people, you know, particularly the young people, you know, they are growing up on this type of fear and apprehension, you know, when they go to school, you know.
The, overarching sense is that people would rather just go unnoticed, unseen.
Which brings us to this next part of the reports.
Okay, here we go. So the 2013 report says, the security situation in the north and east has greatly improved since the end of the military conflict.
Look, is it an improvement from overt war? Probably yes. Is it an improvement from constant shelling and bombing? Yeah. But by forcing people who were subject to a genocidal regime to live under the watch of the very people who perpetrated unimaginable violence on them is not what I would consider an improvement. People live under constant fear with soldiers who committed basically war crimes, torture, rape out on the streets.
Army camps are there, okay? And at least 3 or 4 Tamils, there's one soldier.
This depends on where you are and at what time. Sometimes it's 1 soldier for every 10 Tamil people. Sometimes it's 1 for 20. Regardless, it's a huge military presence.
We still see Tamils trying to leave when they get the opportunity. It's not as though the problems have gone away. If people aren't leaving the country, if Tamils aren't fleeing the country, it's not because things are good for them. It's simply because the opportunities for leaving have become very much reduced.
So when the report says it's greatly improved, it's really glossing over how bad it still is.
And even if we go to the 2021 report, it still says, quote, the security situation in Sri Lanka, particularly in the north and the east, has improved significantly since the end of the civil war in May 2009.
So not much different. What it should actually say is, whilst the north and east of Sri Lanka are not under constant shelling and bombings since the end of the Civil War, the people living there, mainly Tamils, are still living under a heavily militarised presence, restricting their freedom.
Which leads us into this next section, torture.
Okay, so the 2013 report says torture is prohibited by law, but, quote, in practice, there are reports that Sri Lankan citizens of all ethnic groups have been tortured and or abused by the Sri Lankan police and security forces. It then goes on to say, quote, there is no evidence that all such reports are credible. Can I just say that this wording is like already suspicious? Like they could have said there's evidence that some reports are credible, but they've just flipped it to the negative where there's no evidence that all reports are credible. I smell a fish.
It's quite outrageous, really, that the agency can even claim that there's no evidence that all reports of torture are credible, because 2013 was actually almost, I don't know how to say it, like a bonanza year for torture reporting.
We've spoken with some of those who allege state brutality.
We've got 75 cases where we are very clear that the evidence is compelling that these people were subject to rape and sexual violence, and overwhelmingly this is violence carried out by members of the Sri Lankan security forces.
They beat me severely. They burned cigarettes on my back.
If you analyse the political situation in Sri Lanka at the time, the president was still Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was the president during 2009.
As in, the president in 2013 is the same president who oversaw the end of the Civil War, Mullivai, where at least 40,000 Tamil civilians were killed, if not more.
He spearheaded the genocide against the Tamil population.
Yes, Tamils are being tortured, and nothing is documented very clearly by the reporter from the UNHRC.
The International Truth and Justice Project report from 2014 found that arbitrary detention, torture, and rape all increased in the post-war period. Often, those suspected of being connected to the Tamil Tigers were targeted.
So people like Nades.
If the shoe fits. Now things change in the 2019 report.
Okay, DFAT assesses that reports of torture carried out by Sri Lankan military and intelligence forces during the war and in its immediate aftermath are credible. Okay, so they're credible now.
But look down there.
Quote, however, DFAT is unable to verify allegations of torture since 2016.
When you have reports, so the International Truth and Justice Project reported on it, Freedom from Torture in the UK reported on it, that torture is still ongoing and that they have seen examples of this, they have investigated, they've done their due diligence. And these are organisations that are experts in this.
The ITJP reported that between 2015 to 2017, 76 Tamils were tortured and in many cases sexually violated in illegal detention.
Look, I think it's important to recognise that people live with a very high level of fear. Fear of speaking out, fear of being seen or noticed by any authorities. I don't think enough is being done to investigate whether there is any credibility to these claims before saying that there isn't any credibility to it.
This kind of gives off flat earther vibes. Like, you yourself may not be able to verify the earth is round, but there's a whole lot of evidence and experts that say that it is, just like there's so much reporting and witnesses of torture post-2016. So please tell me it gets better in the 2021 report.
Why don't you have a look, Jay?
Okay, so it doesn't have the line about being unable to verify allegations of torture since 2016. That's good.
Yeah, but that's not all. Look down there.
Quote, DFAT assesses that Sri Lankans face a low risk of torture overall. Is that not the case?
By grouping all Sri Lankans as one, you take away the reason Tamil people are being persecuted and the Muslim population is being persecuted, and the reason they're fleeing that persecution coming to countries like Australia.
If you look at this whole section on torture, Tamil people aren't mentioned once.
So by grouping Tamils in with all other Sri Lankans, you minimize what's happening way more to one particular group. And it just makes it seem like it's not that big of a deal overall.
Yeah, it's as weird as saying, like, the risk of breast cancer amongst all people is low, so we don't need to worry about it. When in fact, we know it affects women significantly more than men. So the 2021 report says, quote, DFAT assesses that Sri Lankans face a low risk of torture overall.
But what it really should say is DFAT assesses that Tamils face a higher risk of torture overall compared to the Sinhalese.
Oh my god, you're doing so well, JB.
Thank you.
And the problem is, this information was known back in 2016. It was known well before 2016. And you can literally just Google or YouTube this stuff. You have the Associated Press, Human Rights Watch, Al Jazeera, all reporting on torture, sexual violence, rape. And you have people like Krishna who are constantly reporting to DFAT on the situation in Sri Lanka. You have organizations like RACS and the Asylum Seeker Resource Center and the Human Rights Law Center letting DFAT know their concerns about the country information report and updating them with current information. You have people like Avi doing this as well.
So I've had meetings with DFAT where I've expressed concerns about the country information report. I've written reports highlighting precisely where it's inaccurate and providing the accurate version of those points, and have had acknowledgement for what I've said, but haven't really seen the results of it reflected in reports.
And there's so many other examples of misinformation in the report, like the appointment of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, which...
It's a one way of trying to reduce the heat of that war crimes. I don't think anything has happened.
Or how it says Tamils, quote, face a low risk of official or societal discrimination based on ethnicity or caste.
All of the logic is missing.
And we asked DFAT about these reports, even giving them timely evidence contradicting these reports. And they said, the country information reports are developed through a rigorous process of in-country information gathering and extensive consultation. Country information reports are a snapshot in time, and situations in countries can change rapidly. Over time, reports will inevitably become less current.
Okay, and what do you think of that response?
They're pretty much ignoring the timely evidence we just provided to them in their response. It's a bit bullshit.
Okay, wow. So the reports are consistently inaccurate and really downplay the discrimination and experience of Tamil people in the North and East. Even though they have the correct information, it's not hard to come by. So why? Why are the reports doing this?
Because of international government relations.
Thrilling.
Australian country reports, indeed any country reports on other countries, are always going to be influenced by the perspectives of the government of the day and what they want out of the bilateral relationship. So they're not necessarily accurate documents.
Obviously, they serve a purpose, which is to very, very narrow down who and who isn't eligible to apply for asylum in Australia. And I think that's what we've seen in the UK as well. So I think in that sense, I'm not surprised at all by it.
I think they're inaccurate because if the country information report was to accurately depict what life in Sri Lanka is for particularly Tamil or Muslim people, then it would mean accepting Tamil refugees who've come here. It would mean accepting that what the Australian government has done to these people for the last decade has been nothing short of inhumane.
How do these reports make you feel?
Really disheartened, particularly when I was working as a refugee lawyer, because you wait for the reports and then they come out and you're like, oh, Control F, Tamil's mentioned 4 times. Great, this is going to be solid. And then you sit there reading the report and you think, okay, well, now I need to go and do the job that this person should have done in the first place and find all the information that they're missing, corroborate it, and put them in submissions back to the Department of Immigration to have the department come back and say, sorry, we accept that you've given us this information, but because we rely on the DFAT information, we don't accept your claims. It always felt like a never-ending cycle.
So am I right in saying that even if you present other evidence, they would hold the DFAT report higher than that?
That's right.
Everything. They know everything. I mean, which is, at least the amount of information I have given for the last 10 years. I believe the Australian government knows the gravity of the problem. And what has happened, they know.
So just to summarize, our country information reports on Sri Lanka are probably deliberately inaccurate because 1, we don't want to piss off the Sri Lankan government who we have close ties with, and 2, we don't want to accept Tamil refugees. Like, we can't say the situation is so bad for Tamil people because it will not only mean we have to approve more claims of Tamil asylum seekers, but it would also say that we know the Sri Lankan government, the government we have this close relationship with, is still doing horrific things to Tamil people.
And so we have these inaccurate reports that have to be used in an asylum seeker's application. And it means that so many people's claims for asylum would have been rejected because of this. Here's Karina, the family's lawyer, again.
I don't necessarily think it was fair because I think the problem also with Sri Lanka at the time was that there was a general view that it was safe for Tamils to return.
But in a world where the reports were accurate, and if Priya had proper representation to help with her visa application.
I mean, yeah, with that information, it's much harder to say that she doesn't need protection.
But that's not the world we're living in. The one we're living in is the one where Priya, Nades, Gopika, and Dharnika are almost deported back to Sri Lanka, and they're now being held in Melbourne detention because of the country information reports and because of the broken visa application system. They're being held there because our government, it seems, doesn't want people like them to be able to stay.
But you know who does want them to stay? Their Biloela community.
Right. You have all these mostly women who have gone, hang on, we're not okay with what the government is doing to this family. And so they start to organize. First with a small vigil in Melbourne, and then a rally. But remember, this group of people don't have a history of activism.
Fortunately, we had some amazing groups that took us under their wings at the start and showed us the ropes.
This is Drop Everything and Go Angela again, who ends up being the main spokesperson for the campaign.
Most people think I'm this outgoing person, but I'm actually an introvert with social anxiety. But I was just so overwhelmed, like when I turned up just to see all these individuals who had never met Priya and Nades, who turned up. Like it was just so uplifting.
And then another friend of the family's, Vashni, who was living in Biloela at the same time as Priya and Nades, gets looped into the campaign. She's also a Tamil refugee.
They wanted to talk to Priya, so I'm like interpreting for Priya.
And Vashni starts helping and speaking at the rallies.
Even though my English wasn't good, but I thought I need to speak because I've been in a situation. I'm a Sri Lankan. I'm from Sri Lanka. I've been in a war, so it's powerful to tell the story from my voice.
Meanwhile, Dharnika turns 1 and has her first of 3 birthdays in detention.
When the girls would have birthdays, you know, you'd actually see a group photo with like lots of the detainees all standing together celebrating. And yeah, it's amazing how humanity survives even amongst the harshest of conditions.
And remember that Change.org petition they started?
Oh yeah.
Well, in May 2018, they delivered the petition to then Immigration Minister Peter Dutton's office. It had 98,745 signatures. The crowd-funded campaign buys up 22 billboards, including one in Dutton's Electric, pleading the Prime Minister to bring the family home. And then a year later, in May 2019, the petition gets delivered again to the new Immigration Minister David Coleman's office. We spoke to Change.org's campaign bae, Nick Dorward, who was working there at the time.
This extraordinary coalition of people turned up. Mums for Refugees folks, men and women from Biloela, Craig Foster, Socceroos Hunk and Human Rights Hunk, lots of other amazing community groups. And they just walked on in and delivered the box to David Coleman's office.
What was in the box?
What was actually in the box would have probably just been like a ream of paper from Officeworks and the petition on a USB. I don't think we printed the petition. We don't usually do that because it's not very good for the environment. That was 190,000 signatures back in 2019. It's really big. For a bit of context, we usually will think about delivering a petition when it's around 35,000 to 50,000 signatures to the federal parliament.
Do you want to look at what the petition's at now?
Okay, the petition's now closed with a total of 596,429 signatures. That is huge.
Fucking huge. And then another friend of the family, Marie, she's a non-confrontational, doesn't like the spotlight on her, doesn't want to make a fuss sort of person, a Christian conservative. Even she goes down to Sydney to ask a question on the ABC show Q&A.
We've got another question. This one's from Marie Austin. Hello, Marie.
Hi. Our town love this little family
and we want them. We want them to come home. What more could we do to ensure that Priya, Nadis, Kopika and Thanika return home to Biloela?
Jim, I'll start with you. It's a tough one.
I don't know what Peter Dutton has done. I happen to have great faith in Peter Dutton.
The Liberal Party member on the panel that night says he'll bring it up with then Immigration Minister Peter Dutton.
It's incredible how this one incident got all of these people to come together. Kind of like the Avengers. All these different superheroes with different priorities and interests joining forces to fight for this one family.
Yeah, and it's not like they were all close friends before, and they definitely weren't activists. The Home to Billow campaign literally brings them together to fight for this cause.
So, do they make any progress with our government?
Not at all. The family are kept in Melbourne detention, essentially a prison, for almost a year and a half. The Department of Home Affairs themselves state that detention remains a last resort and occurs for the shortest possible period.
Yeah, evident by people being there for over 9 years.
And their day-to-day is pretty grim as well.
For 8 months, there were no activities. We were under house arrest. We couldn't go outside. We couldn't meet people. At a later point, people from Nauru were brought to the other 13 houses that were in our facility. That's when they relaxed our restrictions and we were able to talk to some of the other asylum seekers.
And for their 2 young girls, this detention center is just not a conducive environment for learning and hitting all those developmental milestones that parents are always looking out for. There aren't any play groups, no social interaction with other kids. Priya even says that they have very little access to the outdoors for 7 months.
7 months!
Medical records, seen by Guardian Australia, note both girls suffered severe vitamin deficiencies.
I mean, little access to the outdoors and other kids, that's surely going to have a huge impact.
Yeah, and Dharnika hasn't even turned 1 when she is detained. And as any new baby would, she starts growing teeth, but...
As there was no healthy food, she became iron deficient and her teeth started to rot. As soon as her teeth started to yellow, I knew something was wrong and took her to the doctor. The doctors we had available tried to brainwash us. The doctor said, sometimes kids have teeth like this and that in a few days it will change colour. I disagreed and said teeth that are newly grown should be white and shiny. For my older daughter, that's how it was. I told him that I didn't believe what he was saying. I was told to just wait and see.
We didn't know that being detained would cause all these problems for our kids. After, a paediatric nurse came to see us. She confirmed to IHMS that there was an issue with her teeth and a follow-up appointment was made at a Melbourne Children's Hospital. She was diagnosed with a vitamin D deficiency. The doctors said that they can quickly sort it out and give her fillings. But this couldn't happen without Serco's approval. Serco did not approve. Her situation worsened and she got an infection.
Wow, this story just gets wilder and wilder.
Yeah. Now, Serco says Priya and Nades were responsible for the general care and hygiene of their children, as they would if they were living in the community.
But they're not actually able to care in that way because being in detention means they can't take their kids to the dentist or to hospital when they want to.
Her face was swollen. It had ballooned. I have photos as proof. I'm not here telling any lies. I am speaking truthfully.
Which reminds me of that review of detention centres where it talks about how guards aren't properly trained.
Yeah, and it's in their contracts that they can't talk to media or say much at all about their experience in detention centres. But there's this great story by the Global Mail that recounts one guard's experience, all anonymously. We've got a voice actor to read parts out for us.
It's not hard to get a job with Serco. They hire quickly and in big groups. You don't have to have qualifications or anything. This guy came and introduced himself as our trainer. His last job was in the prison system. He told us, the only thing that's different is the clothes we let them wear. I remember one day they were teaching us how to physically restrain people. It was like a role play. I volunteered. As it was happening and the officers were restraining me, sitting on top of me and squeezing my pressure points, all I could think was that this was happening to a refugee inside the centre, or a Tamil guy who had lived through war and was fleeing torture. I couldn't handle it. I kept having to disappear out of the room.
So Dharnika doesn't get the treatment she needs, and of course the situation gets worse.
The Department of Immigration didn't do what the doctor asked. The doctor had to write to the department 3 or 4 times with no response before getting in touch with the Children's Commissioner. I had also complained to them about the conditions that we were in. After 4 months of this, whilst waiting for the approvals, Taranika's teeth got infected and started to hurt. She was prescribed antibiotics, but her situation worsened. She didn't eat much and she lost weight.
Priya has to now chew Taranika's food before feeding her. Now by this time, they're no longer being watched 24/7.
The officers would come and open up at 6 a.m. and leave and lock our doors by 6 p.m. Taranika got sick and I didn't have any Panadol syrup on hand. IHMS would not be available in the evening. I tried to call Serco to take Taranika to the hospital, but they would not pick up the phone.
My co-workers were good people, but to be able to sleep at night, they had to convince themselves that the people they were guarding were dangerous. None of the Serco staff had any understanding of what the people had been through before they arrived in Australia.
I would knock our door, I would call, but no one responded. Taranika was throwing up that morning. I kept calling, but no one would respond. Eventually, at 5:30 a.m, the woman at the reception returned my call. I explained that no one had picked up the phone or opened the doors despite me repeatedly trying to ask for help. The receptionist eventually arranged for us to see a nurse at 6 a.m. Hours passed. It was almost 9:30 and still no one had come.
The detainees did crazy things to express their frustration. One day, there was an emergency code on the radio. I walked around the corner and there was a guy with a whole bunch of broken glass in his mouth. He said he would swallow it if we didn't meet his demands. His demands weren't much. From memory, all he wanted was to see his case manager. The Serco officers told me to keep walking.
There was a phone, laptop and TV. I smashed them all. Eventually, Serco came and asked what was going on. I said, "Oi, are you taking us to the doctor or not? Or do I need to keep breaking things?" Within 10 minutes, they took us to the doctor. After this, they put me under surveillance for a day because I broke all the things. They told IHMS what I had done. IHMS came and asked me what had happened. I said I didn't know.
I wondered about what they'd been through before they arrived here. You know, war, torture, trauma. And I wondered whether we weren't just making things worse. Nobody on the outside believed how bad it was in there.
They only took us to the hospital after I broke those things. If I had been calm, my child would not have received any treatment.
Taranika is taken to hospital and has 4 of her teeth surgically removed. At 2 years old, she now won't have any front teeth until her adult teeth grow in.
I used to be a very soft person, but they hardened me. For 36 years of my life, I hadn't spent a single night away from my parents. Even if people spoke bad about me, and even if they were wrong, I wouldn't say anything because they were older than me. I was always soft-natured. After being taken to detention and enduring this torture, I've become a cold, hardened person. When the kids do something wrong, I speak louder than I would have otherwise. Because of this stress, this depression, I'm left with anger and sadness.
Why is it so hard to get medical attention in detention centres? What are some of the other health impacts of detention centres?
And how did the family end up on Christmas Island? That's next on
You Have Been Told a Lie. You have been told a lie.
Did you enjoy today's episode? Let us know over at You Have Been Told a Lie on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. And because Twitter has a character limit for its handles, find us at Been Told a Lie on Twitter.
If you're bored and want to read country information reports, the reports by the International Truth and Justice Project, the Kwanda video, and the webcomic by a Circle Guard published by the Global Mail, you can find links to those at our website, youhavebeentold.lie.com, where you can also find all of our references and the transcript for this episode.
We note that asylum seekers experience a lot of trauma, not only before arriving at our borders, but also living in detention. This has an impact on recollection and details.
Due to the nature of Priya and Nadesa's journey across borders, there are some aspects of their story that we will only ever know from their perspective. We have reached out to relevant parties where possible, and where comments were provided, a summary has been included.
When we reached out to Serco for a response, they made a point to mention that Serco does not employ guards, they employ detainee service officers, welfare officers, and programs and activities staff. Weirdly, SBS, The Guardian, ABC, and even the Department of Home Affairs refer to them as Serco guards. Additionally, it's hard for detainees and visitors to know the correct titles for the Serco staff, so you may have heard people in this episode refer to them as Serco guards.
This episode is written by Jay Uy and produced by Jay Uy and Tanesh Raja.
Audio editing is by myself.
Tamil translations by Tanesh, me, and Neeraja Samuhanathan.
Priya's English translation is voiced by Emma Harvey, and Nadez's English translation is voiced by Matthew Predney, who also composed the music you're listening to right now.
The consulting producer is Rebecca Holt.
Special thanks to Priya, Nadez, Kopika, Tharanika, the Home to Billa team, and the interviewees in this episode: Karina Ford, Nick Dorwood, Bronwyn Dendel, Aaron Milvaganam, Angela Fredericks, Ben Doherty, Margot Plant, Simone Cameron, Rebecca Holt, Marie Austin, Ingrid Selvaratnam, Abhinaya Nathan, Avi Silva, Damien Kingsbury, Krishna, Vashni Rizwan, and MacArthur Amy, who voiced the Serco guard.
Thanks to Miles Martignoni, Jess Bennett, Cassandra Steeth, and Scott Spark for script and story advice, and MacArthur Amy for helping with research and fact-checking.
This series is possible thanks to the Jesse Cox Audio Fellowship. Thank you Q-Min Liu, Benjamin Law, Scott Spark, Jess Bennett, Carly Reid, Claire Holland, and the rest of the team.
There have been many people we've spoken to who have helped in so many ways, and many who have asked to remain anonymous. We see you, we thank you for your support.
This podcast was written, edited, and produced on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge all elders past, present, and emerging.
We also pay our respects to the traditional custodians of Gungaloo country, where Biloela is now situated. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land.
A lie.
On the next episode of You Have Been Told a Lie, another attempted deportation?
And more health issues whilst the family is under the care of our government.
Now, they argued that this entire ordeal could have been avoided had she received treatment sooner.